I actually started thinking about the future of work 10 years ago. In fact, it is a decade since I founded the Future of Work Consortium, which was my research group that looked at the future of work. And to be honest, when I started it, I thought it'll take about 2 years. We'll know all about the future of work. And then we can move on and run a consortium about something else. Well, guess what? 10 years later, and what's happened is the future of work has migrated from something that HR geeks like us were interested in to things that HR people in general are interested in, to things that CEOs are really interested in. And so I'm in the, which I've never been actually before in my whole life, in this situation where what we're saying in terms of people is now incredibly interesting and important to CEOs, to economists, to governments, and to educators. And I want to, in the next 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, just really highlight some of the key issues I think are arising as we think about the future of work. But then also, I want to say something about what I think we can do as corporations, but also what I think we should be encouraging governments to do. So let's really start with this question of imagining a world. So you could think about it 10 years hence, 20 years hence. I have an elective at London Business School called The Future of Work. It is the most difficult. So our students have a thing where they're given a certain number of chips that they can use to get onto a program. We have an internal market, in other words, in our second year. It's the most difficult elective to get on. The students really, really want to know about the future of work. So I had 90 of them last week for a week, which is still resonating with me. So some of the things I'm going to say today are really partly to do with that. But one of the things I asked them to do, they're a bit younger than us. Well, they're certainly a great deal younger than me, and maybe a bit younger than you. And I started off by asking them to draw a timeline between 2018 and when they were going to die. Do you know that's 2080? And once you actually write that down, you actually write down 2080. Whoa, that's a long time, isn't it? And lots going to happen. And that's really what I want us to think about today, that it's a long time, and a lot's happening. And so imagine a world where, so that's what I'd sort of like you to do just this afternoon, is just imagine what will happen to you, to your children, to your the people in your corporations. And indeed, I'm also interested in citizens these days, so I also think about what governments should be doing. So let me start with a really simple piece. This is really the beginning of the book that Andrew Scott and I wrote, which was called The 100-Year Life. And neither Andrew and I are demographers. I'm a psychologist, and he's an economist. That's a rather unusual combination. Turns out to be, as we always know, through diversity, it is one of, if you can make it work, and it's trusting, we heard all about that from Randall earlier, it's a fantastic combination of diversity. And we've been, I think, we've had a marvelous time, so much so that we've finished another book, which you'll see next year. And actually, this is sort of a bit what I'm talking about today, in fact. So imagine you live in a world where you're going to live a great deal longer. I don't know how long that would be, but honestly, I think you should imagine that you're going to live into your 90s or 100. It depends how your age. My kids will live to 100. I might. I'm going to try. And I bet many of you will. So I want to introduce you, in terms of this imagination about what it is to live to 100, to a woman called Susan. So the book that we've written, I don't know if you read The 100-Year Life, but you saw there was a whole series of characters in it. Those turned out to be an incredible literary device, and I'm going to use it again. So I'm going to introduce you to a series of characters, and I'd like you to think about yourself, but also about the world through their eyes. And for this piece of data, I want to introduce you to Susan. So Susan lives in Australia. She works for one of the banks, actually. Well, no, she works for one of the professional service firms that you might have come across. She's 55 years old, done pretty well. And she's just been asked by the company to start thinking about retiring because she's 55 years old, okay? Now, Susan, being a sensible person, has looked at this data and she's expecting now to live until she's 90. So first of all, keep Susan in mind. So what will Susan do? By the way, and this is I mean, there's many marvelous things about being a professor, but one of them is, so the personas I've got in the book, and I've introduced you to one, to Susan, but I'm going to introduce you to two more, I've set as an exam question to my MBA students. How sneaky is that? So they're actually, as we speak, working on essays about what will Susan do. I'm sure they're going to come up with better ideas than I have. So that's the first question. What will Susan do? Okay. Second, this is the first piece of data. Second piece of data, is Christian. So my second character is Christian. Christian actually is my son. Now, I mentioned Christian because the other one, Dominic, gets a lot of airtime in my books. So Chris thinks that he should also get mentioned. So this is Christian. Christian is only young, obviously. He's in his early 20s. So he's now trying to work out how long he's going to work for. And Andrew Scott, my friend, the economist, very sweetly and kindly and thoughtfully worked it out. And there it is. It doesn't make easy reading, particularly on a day when, but we are about to drink champagne or something. So it will help a lot. I would definitely hit so here you have, he's got three choices. He could think about how much am I saving now? Well, he has me as a mother, so he's going to be saving a lot more than most 20-year-olds because I've been worried about this for a long time. So, but even so, he's probably only saving, let's say, 15% of his income. Secondly, he's got to think about when am I going to retire and what percentage of my final salary would I like to retire on? So let's say he says 70%. And then he can work out from that the age in which he retires. Well, if we do that for Christian, the age comes out at about 80. So that's the second person I'd like you to think about. Imagine you're my son Christian, or any of your kids, or anybody you know who's about 20 years old. The likelihood is that they will work for a great deal of their lives. So imagine that. Now, let me talk very brief. So that's demography, which is fundamentally changing our world. I wrote a book about it. I want to briefly talk about technology, which I wrote a book about called The Shift. And our new book is sort of coming back to all of that again. Now, there's much to be said about technology and work, and I'm very happy to answer any questions about that. But let me just tell you where I think we are now in the narrative about the impact of technology on work. The very first ideas about the impact of technology on work, which was really started by a group at Oxford, Frey and Osborne, suggested massive job loss. So actually, if you'd heard me or others 5 years ago, we would have talked about massive job loss. That turned out to be wrong. And in fact, and the reason that it was wrong was because they looked at work at the level of the job. And as Tammy said this morning, you have to look at work at the level of the task. And most jobs have about 30 tasks in them, some of which are going to be automated, and some of them aren't. So if you redo all those figures, and that's what people are doing right now, on the basis of that data, the task data, rather than the work data, you'll find that fewer jobs are going to go completely, but most jobs are going to change. So I want to introduce you to Tom. So Tom is my third persona, and Tom actually sits here. So what this tells us, and this is work that Dave Autor did, and it's really, I think, the simplest and the best way of thinking about automation and the impact of technology on work, is this. You can think about tasks as routine and non-routine. Routine work is very easy for robots if it's manual, or machine learning if it's cognitive, to do, because both of those machines respond very well to be given, to have rules. And of course, routine jobs have rules associated with them. So you can write the rules that then a machine can do in the case of this analytical work, or that a robot can do in the case of that manual work. And that's sort of where we were about 5 years ago. So if you take a look at job loss, and I haven't got the data to show you, but we actually do show it in one of the books. What you'll see is a hollowing out of the middle. So these middle skill jobs disappeared, because those were mostly these jobs. What was left was two types of jobs, non-routine jobs, some of which actually were highly skilled, and some of them had very low skills. The highly skilled non-routine jobs are these sorts of jobs here: analytical diagnostics, forming hypotheses, persuading and selling. Those are jobs where artificial intelligence is now making a big difference. And we sit here in London, and a mile away from DeepMind, which is one of the world's greatest groups of AI scientists. And I follow them very closely, and you can see that that's moving very quickly. So when I wrote my book, The Shift, I dedicated it to my two kids. Dominic, the other one, said to me at the time, "Mum, I want to be a doctor." And I had said to it, I wrote in The Shift, what a ridiculous thing to do. Because obviously, you know, medical diagnostics and so on. Well, he did become a doctor, and he's now becoming a surgeon, but you know, he didn't listen to his mother. I don't know if you've got that same problem. I got married in the interim, so I now have 8 children. None of them, listen, take any notice of me at all. But actually, that's sort of what's happening to our type of jobs. But then non-routine jobs also come in manual forms, like truck driving and like janitorial services. And Tom, one of my other personas, sits here. So Tom drives a truck. He's one of 3 million people in America who drive trucks. So the other thing I want to ask you is, what happens to Tom? What happens to Tom? That's what I'd like you to be thinking about. Now, it seems as if it's going to be fine for all of us, isn't it? Because we're all sitting here, we're not manual, we're analytical, and it's already great. Well, I thought that was the case as well until I was in Denmark a few months ago. Now, I'm pleased to tell you, and I have seen Pepper, it's this robot, on many occasions, because I spend quite a lot of time. Actually, I'm wearing exactly the same thing. You can see what a lazy dresser I am. The only difference is there I was wearing sparkly high heels, and this time I put them on this morning and thought, I can't be bothered. So I put my flat shoes on, but they're Valentino, so you know, you still sort of get it. You sort of still get it, don't you? It's not the Louboutin, but it was, anyway. So this thing, actually, it thinks it's smart, but it really isn't that smart. But it is finding its way into lots of wherever I seem to go these days, I see bloody Pepper around. So I go into Japan and try and buy something in Japan, and this thing is talking to me. And then I went to Denmark to speak at the Danish government thing, and there it is, with me. Now, look, it can't move. So it's just sitting there uselessly. But at the same time, you see that all of us could sort of be taken over, couldn't we? It's not going to, if those guys at DeepMind have got anything to go by, it's not going to be long before that thing is doing what I'm doing, but probably a hell of a lot better. And of course, it could do it all over the world. So the truth is that whether we're Tom or Susan or Christian, all of us are being impacted by the things that are happening around us. And I want to just mention one other area, and it's the area of social trends. You know, part of the issue that we face in the future of work is that it's the intersection of many different disciplines. That's why I was really fortunate to work with Andrew, because it's the intersection of economics and psychology. It's the intersection of demography and psychology, but it's also the intersection of sociology. And I think that we haven't listened to, probably partly their fault as well, but I don't think the voices of sociologists have been heard sufficiently in our debate about the future of work. I can see lots of people nodding about that. So what's happening here? Well, two things are really interesting about the future of work and families. The first is women are working. It's an enormous social trend. It's astounding. They're just getting out of their houses into the workforce in enormous numbers in every place in the world, even places like Japan where you think they're not going to get into work. They are. They're given crap jobs and they're not being promoted, but they are moving into work. And eventually, we hope things in Japan will get better for them. But actually, that's the most extraordinary thing. It's really going to influence the future of work. And what we're also seeing is a fundamental shift in the relationships at home. And that sort of affects work, because here we have, you know, this isn't my mum and dad, and that isn't me, but honestly, it could be. I looked almost exactly like that when I was that age. This is 1950. This is me, really. And here we have a typical 1950s family. Dad works. He's got a career. Mum's a carer and home-based. And it's actually, when you think about quite a lot of the way we think about work, it's really made for that, isn't it? That's what it's made for. But then we begin to see that that changed. It changed more where people had a career and then the woman was beginning to have a job. And now we see a huge, enormous amount of diversity in terms of family structure. So what it is to be a partner, what it is to be a family is completely transforming. And it's certainly in my own research, I asked one of my sociologist researchers to count the number of names for a family, you know, the different family structures. She came to at least 16, enormous variety. But what we're also seeing is people are trying to form partnerships where both of them are working. Now, historically, that has not been the case. And actually, if you look at historic data on that career plus career, you'll find it's a very small proportion of people of my age. But actually, over time, it gets bigger. So the third person, or the fourth, if we include Chris, the fourth person I want you to think about as a persona is Hiroki. And Hiroki is a guy who lives in Kanazawa, which is on the other side of Tokyo. I've got to have a Japanese person in my books, of course, because The 100-Year Life was the best-selling book in Japan. Not of business books, of all books. It was brought up to almost 500,000. It was unbelievable. So actually, when I write a book, all I'm writing for is Japanese people. I mean, I try and think about you guys, and I'll bring in Tom, and you know, but basically, it's Japan. That's where we're writing for at the moment. So here's Hiroki, and he's a typical Japanese guy in the sense that incredibly traditional family structures. He doesn't want to be like his dad. He wants to spend more time with his children, something his dad didn't do. He'd like to have a flexible work life, which Japanese companies don't have. And actually, his partner is very ambivalent about having children. And this, by the way, is reflected right the way through Japan at the moment. Very low birth rate. So the question I really wanted to start this afternoon off with is, what would you do? If you were any of these people, what would you do? What would you do about that? And I want to show what I think is beginning to happen. The first is, you'd probably say, look, I've got a long life. I'm Susan. I've got to find another job, and I already know that the chances of my getting another job at 55 are low, which is true, by the way. It's absolutely astoundingly difficult to get a job over the age of 55 if you're out of the labor market. So how's she going to do that? She's going to have valuable skills, isn't she? Or what about Tom? You know, Tom's driving driving a truck. He's not dumb. I mean, he knows about automation. He knows that his job will probably disappear, but he doesn't know when, and he doesn't know what will come in its place. And by the way, and I was yesterday with the chief economist for the Bank of England and a whole bunch of economists, and I asked them about Tom. And I said, what will Tom do? And there was absolutely no agreement. So it's not as if when Tom is feeling stressed now and not sure about the future, it's not because he doesn't know anything or he's being difficult or he's not being, you know, as good as we are at thinking about the future. He doesn't know. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. But here are the guesses that those people are going to make. Firstly, we sort of know that the stuff that is important in the long term, that artificial intelligence and robotics can't do, is sort of stuff like that. So it would be wise for you to think about what would valuable skills look like. And this is the World Economic Forum report. I'm a steward of the World Economic Forum on gender, jobs, and what else is there? There's another one, gender, jobs, something else, I can't remember. Education, that's it. And so well, we had them separately and then we just pulled them all together. So this is something that we came up with, which honestly isn't rocket science, but actually just begins to talk about some of the skills that people will want. Just take a look at those. Those are quite high-level skills, and they're quite difficult to develop. The second thing that we think Susan, and particularly Christian, because he's young, but probably Heiko as well, will want, is they will want to move to a more complex way of designing their lives. So if you think about the guy I showed you at the beginning, you know, in the book I called him Jack. In the 100-Year Life he was called Jack. You know, Jack had a straightforward 3-stage life. Full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement. And here's the kicker. Most of the educational and corporate and governmental practices and policies that supported Jack were built from that. Because what it assumed is, it made a couple of fundamental assumptions. One is it assumed that everyone would go through that sequence. And secondly, it assumed that everybody would do it at the same time in their life. Now, that meant that when Jack was making a transition, everybody around him was making the same transition. So he didn't have to learn about transformational skills because he didn't have to transform. He just had to do what everybody else did. And secondly, it meant that age equals stage. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why we got so overly concerned about people's age, is because if we knew their age, we knew their stage, okay? Chronological age, that is. So here's what we think is going to start happening. We think that Tom and Susan and Christian and Hoki will want to build, I haven't got his name right yet, have I? It's the first time I've used it. I could have thought it out. We think they are going to build multi-stage lives. What might that look like? Well, there's a first thing you notice about this is it's got a lot more stages in it. And that's because, you know, why would you want to do all your education in one blast? Especially when you're young. Why would you do that? So we'd expect education to come in all sorts of different ways, and we've called it exploration and self-employment. Secondly, why would you want to work from the age of 20 to the age of 80? That's the figure, by the way. So we haven't said that. We say 70 now because 80 feels too scary, but it is actually 80. And anyone who looks at the data can work that out, but most people decide not to. Very, very wise. Yeah. So why would you want to do that non-stop? You know, why wouldn't you want to start your own business or make a transition or build a portfolio or go plural or have et cetera, et cetera? And why would anyone, even if they could retire at 60, why would anyone do that? That's an awfully long time on the golf course. What are you going to do? And actually, the data on retirement and health outcomes is mixed. Most of the data shows that people who have jobs for longer are less likely to become ill and less likely to have Alzheimer's. There's clear data on that. However, that only works if you have a good job. If you have a bad job where you're very tired and it's very stressful and you're physically exhausted, then actually health outcomes go down over the age of 60. But for people with good jobs, it's very good to carry on working. So this creates all sorts of problems, particularly for corporations, because that requires two things, again, happen there. One is everybody doesn't go through the same sequence. They go through different sequences at different times. And secondly, they come in and out of the workforce. And that transition in and out of the workforce is something that corporations and governments find extremely difficult to come to terms with. So what we're seeing at the moment, and it rather comes back to the point that Tammy made earlier on today, is experimentation. And what we've been watching is just, I think these are weak signals. So I look to see how many people around the world are beginning to experiment, who are, for example, beginning to work longer, or beginning to build a portfolio, or beginning to start their own business over the age of 55, or beginning to go on a gap year when they're 40. And actually, of course, what you see is the courageous ones are already doing that. Because they're the ones who are already saying, I'm going to take responsibility for my life. I'm going to do something different. Now, where does that leave us? So I've worked in the field of future of work now for 10 years. And a couple of years back, I got very excited about artificial intelligence and work. Last year, I got excited about demography, or 2 years ago, I got excited about demography and work. But actually, one of the things that happened in the interim is people asked me to start actually not just talking about this stuff, but actually to start making recommendations. And I was asked by the Singaporean government, and now more recently by the Japanese Prime Minister, to make recommendations about this. So that meant that rather than just talk about it, as we're doing now in a sort of slightly relaxed way, I had to stand up, as I've done, in a council with the Japanese Prime Minister and 8 of his ministers and say what I think we should do. And actually, the interesting thing is all the roads lead back to lifelong learning. They just do. You know, if you think about Susan, what's Susan going to do? What's she going to do? She's 55. What's she going to do? Anything. She's got to start learning again, hasn't she? Yeah, retrain. What's Tom going to do? He's got to find another job, hasn't he? He's got to do something else. What's Chris going to do, my son? What does he do? He's got to take time out to learn right the way through his life. And so when I said today that I would talk about lifelong learning, it wasn't because you're people who are interested in lifelong learning. It's because this is what I'm saying to everyone. That's what I'm saying to the Treasury, to the chief economist last night. This is what I believe to be absolutely crucial. Now, the challenge here is that we're not set up for it. None of us are set up for it. And why is that the case? Well, it's because if you take a look at the capacity for Tom or Susan to be lifelong learners, a whole set of things have got to be in place. And they have different stakeholders with different needs and different expectations. So if I said to you, well, let me ask you, who's responsible for retraining Tom? Whose responsibility is that, do you think? Tom. It's Tom. But hang on. Tom only gets paid $400 a week after tax. He doesn't have any savings. We know Tom's not got any savings. He hasn't got the money. So what are you saying should happen to Tom? He can't afford to be retrained. So what are you saying?
Maybe his organisation is moving to the trucks that are driven.
So you think... So maybe it's corporation. But hang on, the corporations say, we're not... In fact, actually, we, as part of the Japanese piece of work I did, we got all of the Japanese companies to say how much money they've spent on training in the last 5 years. Guess what? And this is Japan. It's gone down. Why has it gone down? Why wouldn't you spend so much money training people? Well, because you say, what's the point? They're not going to stay. Why would I do that? So companies. So well, what about governments? Shouldn't you, as a taxpayer, be supporting Tom? I don't know. Should you?
Well,
you should.
You're supporting young people as well.
Yeah, we're supporting young people. Why wouldn't we support? So who pays that? Through tax. So how do you feel about that?
I feel good about it.
Good. I feel good about it as well, actually. Yeah. But do you see the problem? I mean, actually, honestly, if this was an easy problem, we would have solved it by now, wouldn't we? But it's one of those problems, and there's a couple in the world right now, where you have to get lots of different institutional forms to work together. And so I want to end really by saying a little bit about how that's working right now. It's not really working very well, but let me give you a few ideas about that. Firstly, corporations are doing stuff. And if you look, and I've written up a couple of cases, Westpac, I mentioned to you, is a good example of that. They realized that 40% of their jobs will be automated. They built a social media platform with lots and lots of content, with peer groups, with moderators, with this and that, coaches and God knows what. And everybody could go through it. And they found that even the people who were going to lose their jobs felt as if they could do something themselves to retrain. So corporations can do a great... AT&T has put a huge amount of money in the States on that. And if you look at even corporations that are not working collaboratively, you'll see the same thing happen. So in India right now, Infosys, Tata Consulting Service, Wipro work together to educate millions of people, not only in their own company, but also outside of the company. So I think corporations can and must step up, not just to educate their own employees, but actually to educate others around them. If your core competence is your capacity to educate your workers, why wouldn't you want to take that into the outside world? Why wouldn't you do that? Because actually, 3 million Toms feeling unhappy isn't a place where any of us want to be. You know, millions and millions of Susans not being able to find a job after the age of 55 is a pension crisis which is of horrific proportions. I mean, it will be a if we can't help people like Susan work over the age of 55, there will be a pension crisis. We have the data very clearly on that. So isn't it in all our interests, both to do it for ourselves, but also to do it for others? Secondly, shouldn't governments step up here? Shouldn't they be doing that? I mean, why can't they do what Singapore does and give $500 to each employee, each citizen, to spend any way they want? And last week, I had one of the senior civil servants from Singapore over in my office at London Business School, and I said, how's it going? He said, well, actually, we've just analysed the data, and this is what we've found. We've found that the over 55s disproportionately spend that money. They spend more money on learning than anybody else. So we were wrong about learning and being older. And I said, well, what are they spending their money on? He said, well, here's the really funny thing. The second most important area that they've spent their money on is learning Korean. And I said, well, why are they learning Korean? He said, oh, you don't know that in Japan, everybody watches Korean soaps. So everyone's learning. But does it matter? I mean, actually, we know, don't we, that being a learner is being a learner. It really doesn't matter what you learn. You're learning. Or why can't we be like Denmark, you know, who's doing some of those same things as well? So I think governments should step up. And they need to do that really quickly. What about educational institutions? We definitely need to step up. We definitely need to open ourselves up for lifelong learning, and also use some of the technologies that will provide so many opportunities for people. And of course, individuals, how can we help them? Well, again, one of the things that Singapore is doing is they've realized that it's hard for you to be motivated to relearn if you don't know what it is you're relearning. What should Tom actually learn? So one of the things they're doing is at the level of government, they've built industrial pathways for 24 different industry sectors. This is Singapore for you, which shows what's going to happen to that job over the next 5 to 10 years. So people can say, okay, I have an idea of what's going to happen to me. So that's really what I want to finish with. I want to finish by saying, you know, when we think about the future of work, it's easy just to think about our own employees, and that's really where it has to start. But actually, the issues that we face right now are much, much bigger than that. And we in corporations and we in education institutions have got to play a role to support people in what will be, now I say this with thoughtfulness, the largest and fastest transition that mankind has ever gone through. Andrew and I are now saying that. We didn't say it in our last book, because everyone said, well, what about the Industrial Revolution? Or what about the First World War? Or the Second World War? Actually, it's the biggest transition that we've ever gone through. We've got about 10 years. That's all we've got. And then things will sort themselves out. But for Susan and Tom, and for Christian and Haiku, we've got to help them right now to make that transition. Thanks very much.